Okay, let's be honest for a minute. How often do you find yourself, talking about someone who isn't actually there?
Hmm.
Maybe complaining about a coworker or venting about a friend or just sharing a story about something someone did.
It happens all the time, doesn't it? It feels almost unavoidable sometimes.
It really does. And that's kind of what we're diving into today. Not just that urge, but a really specific and honestly quite challenging way to handle conflicts and faults
Hmm.
drawn from this fascinating old religious text.
Right. We're looking at a sermon called The Cure of Evil Speaking. And it's not just saying don't gossip, it actually lays out a step by step method based on scripture for dealing with problems directly instead of, well, talking behind someone's back.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. We need to unpack what this sermon means by evil speaking because it sounds specific. Then figure out why it says it's so common and hard to stop. And then walk through this very detailed three-step cure it proposes. And we should also touch on how it specifically calls out the Methodists, challenging them to adopt this. It's very practical, really.
It really is a very concrete guide for, you could say, community health, contrasting sharply with how things often go.
Okay, let's kick things off right there. What is evil speaking, according to this sermon? Because the definition seems key.
It's absolutely central. The sermon stricts by saying the command speak evil of no man is as serious as thou shalt do no murder, which is intense.
Wow. Okay.
But then it clarifies, what is evil speaking? It is not. The same with lying or slandering. The core definition is simple. Speaking evil of an absent person.
Right, and the really striking part is that this applies even if what you're saying is completely true.
Exactly. The sermon is crystal clear on this. All a man says may be as true as the Bible, and yet the saying of it is evil speaking. It's about relating something negative, something actually done or said by someone who isn't there when you're relating it.
So if I see someone do something wrong or say something I think is off, and I go tell someone else about it, and the first person isn't present.
That's evil speaking, according to this text. Yes.
That's
Yeah.
a much wider net than most people probably cast. It's not about truth or falsehood. It's about the combination of a fault being discussed and the person's absence.
Precisely. And it uses other words too, like backbiting, because you're attacking someone behind their back, or tail bearing, and then there's whispering, which is doing it quietly, maybe pretending you're concerned.
Oh, okay.
But whatever you call it, the basic idea is relating someone's fault when they can't defend themselves or explain.
Okay, so if that's the definition, it's maybe not surprising the sermon finds it incredibly common.
It really emphasizes that. It says this sin is extremely common among all orders and degrees of men. High, low, rich, poor, everyone seems to fall into it. And interestingly, even among people who are generally quite devout, who have the fear of God before their eyes, it's still common in conversation.
It does feel almost universal. Why does the sermon think it's so hard to avoid then? What are the reasons?
It gives a few key reasons. First, just how widespread it is. We're sort of encompassed with it on every side, and seeing others do it makes it seem normal. It's contagious.
Yeah, the example is powerful.
Second, it says it's recommended from within, meaning it appeals to parts of our own nature. It can feed our pride. Talking about someone else's flaws makes us feel a bit better about ourselves, maybe.
Uh-huh. Comparison?
Right. Or it lets us indulge anger or resentment if we're mad at someone. It serves these foolish and hurtful desires, as the text puts it.
So it feels good in a negative way. It validates the ego, the anger. But there's another reason, too, about it attacking in disguise.
Yes, this is a really insightful point about self-deception. We might criticize someone who isn't there, but tell ourselves it's out of noble, generous, holy indignation.
Righteous anger.
Exactly. Or we convince ourselves we're, serving the devil out of pure zeal for God, or punishing wickedness by doing something. Well, wicked itself, according to this definition. The sermon says the passions all justify themselves, and sin can come dressed up as holiness.
That's quite a psychological observation. We can frame it as being virtuous when, according to the text, the act itself, speaking ill of the absent, is the problem, regardless of our perceived motive.
Spot on. And after outlining all this, the prevalence and the difficulty, the sermon asks, but is there no way to avoid the snare? And it points straight to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 15 to 17.
Matthew 18, okay.
It calls this the plain way, the infallible preventative or a certain cure for both the evil speaking and the offenses that often lead to it.
Right, that's the passage where Jesus instructs on what to do if a brother sins against you. So the sermon connects that specific process directly to stopping evil speaking.
Yes, and it links it to the verses just before about how offenses are inevitable. Woe to the world because of offenses, but also the warning to the person causing the offense. This process in verses 15-17 is presented as God's way to handle those offenses without falling into evil speaking.
Okay, so let's unpack this plain way. Step 1. The sermon sounds really absolute about this first step.
It is totally absolute. Step 1 is the command. If thy brother shall sin against thee, go and tell him of his fault between thee and him alone. Period. The sermon insists this is the only thing you're allowed to do first. No alternative is allowed, no choice of anything else. You must go talk to the person privately first.
Between thee and him alone. That takes guts for most of us, I think. But it's not just doing it, is it? The sermon stresses the how. The spirit and manner seem crucial.
Oh, absolutely critical. How you do it determines almost everything. It needs to be in a lowly spirit, remembering any good in you comes from God, a meek spirit, because anger doesn't achieve God's purposes, and most importantly, a spirit of tender love.
Tender love. Confronting someone about a fault with tender love. That sounds, well, really difficult and not how conflict usually goes down.
It's incredibly demanding, but the sermon argues this is the kind of love that conquers all things, that can soften stubbornness and lead to real change. So the manner has to match. No pride, no arrogance, no contempt, no anger or harsh words. Instead, use plain speech, but joined with sweetness as well as gentleness. Maybe even use scripture if appropriate and speak remembering God is watching.
Wow. So direct, but wrapped in humility, gentleness, love, and prayer. What if you literally can't meet them in person? Is there any flexibility?
It does allow for that, yes. If you have not an opportunity of speaking to him in person or cannot have access, then out of necessity, you could use a trusted friend, a messenger who shares your spirit. Or, as a last resort, write a letter.
Writing feels risky. Tone is hard to convey.
The sermon acknowledges that, but suggests writing can sometimes soften the blow for someone quick-tempered and lets them reread it. Putting your name on it makes it almost like going yourself. But it still insists speaking face-to-face is far better. These are just backup options when direct contact isn't feasible, not loopholes to avoid the private chat.
And the sermon doesn't mince words about what happens if you skip step 1, does it?
Not at all. It tackles the common feeling of being burdened by someone's fault and wanting to vent. It says that feeling comes precisely because you've disobeyed God's command to go talk to them privately. By not going, you're essentially trampling the command of God underfoot and hating your brother in your heart.
Hating your brother in your heart. That's incredibly strong language just for not confronting them privately first.
It really shows how seriously the sermon takes this prescribed path. Failing to follow it is seen as neglect, almost like spiritual harm to the other person. And getting relief by telling someone else about the fault instead, that's called a sin of commission, to ease the guilt of the sin of omission. Not doing step 1. You're buying relief at the cost of another sin, a dear purchase.
Wow. That completely reframes seeking comfort by venting to a third party. Is there ever a situation where you can talk about someone's fault before going to them? Any exception?
One and only one. If it's absolutely needful to preserve the innocent. If someone's life or property is genuinely at risk because of another person's actions, you have to speak up immediately, even if the person causing the risk isn't there.
An emergency situation.
Right. But even then, it calls this kind of necessary exposure in its own nature deadly poison. It must be used only out of absolute necessity as rarely as possible and revealing only the bare minimum needed to prevent the harm.
Okay, so a very limited, specific exception for immediate danger. Otherwise, private conversation first. So what if you do step 1? You go, you talk with humility and love, but they will not hear. What next?
Then you move to step 2. The instruction is, take with thee 1 or 2 more. And again, the sermon stresses this is the second step. You only do this after trying step 1 and before you think about step 3. It's a sequence.
And these 1 or 2 more people, they aren't just random friends, right? There are criteria.
Definitely not random. They need to be carefully chosen. People with a loving spirit who love God and others. They should be lowly, meek and gentle, patient and long-suffering. They need wisdom, understanding, endued with wisdom from above. They must be unbiased, impartial, and ideally, people the offender knows and respects.
So basically, wise, humble, loving, patient, respected mediators. What's their job in this second meeting?
They're there to help. Their presence is meant to establish every word, like witnesses to what's said and how the person responds. They should listen calmly, confirm your account from step 1 was fair, add weight to the gentle correction, and support the advice given.
It's like a structured, mediated conversation with objective, caring third parties. Okay? And if that doesn't work, if you've done step 1 and step 2, and the person still refuses to listen,
Then, and the sermon says not till then, you move to the final step, step 3. Tell it to the church.
now the church here, the sermon defines that quite specifically too, doesn't it? Not like the whole denomination.
That's right. It clarifies it means the elder or elders of the church, the leaders or overseers of this specific local congregation or society that both you and the offender belong to, the ones who watch over yours and his soul.
Got it. So after private talk, then mediated talk, now you bring it to the designated spiritual leaders of your shared community.
Exactly. And ideally, this is also done with the offender present. You state the case plainly, but still tenderly. It then becomes the elder's job to assess the situation and deliver a formal rebuke if necessary. The sermon notes that sometimes step 2 and 3 might kind of merge if the elders themselves were the 1 or 2 more witnesses.
Okay. And what if, after all that private, mediated leadership involvement, the person still won't listen or change? What's the outcome then?
At that point, the sermon says you've done everything required by God's word and the law of love. You've delivered your own soul. If the person still will not hear the church, the instruction from Matthew 18 is, let him be to thee as an heathen man and a publican.
As an heathen man and a publican. That sounds really harsh to modern ears. Exclusionary, maybe? How does the sermon explain what that practically means?
It's careful to clarify. It doesn't mean hating them or wishing them harm. You're no longer obligated to dwell on their fault only when you commend him to God in prayer. You shouldn't speak about the issue further, just leaving to his own master. But you still owe them goodwill, courtesy, basic human kindness, the same offices of humanity you'd offer any stranger. The key difference is the relationship changes. No friendship, no familiarity with him, no other intercourse than with an open heathen.
So it's a change in the level of fellowship and intimacy within that specific faith community. A kind of formal distancing, but only after this whole very involved process fails and basic kindness remains.
Exactly. It defines the relationship clearly when reconciliation through the prescribed steps hasn't worked. It frees the offended person from the ongoing burden and sets clear boundaries within the community.
It's such a structured, step-by-step approach. Private first, then mediators, then leadership. Always escalating, only if needed. It seems logical, but also hard. And the sermon itself kind of sighs about how rarely this actually happens.
It does. It asks that poignant question, but if this be the rule by which Christians walk, which is the land where Christians live, it implies it's difficult to find places where this is consistently practiced.
Which leads us to that specific challenge mentioned earlier, aimed particularly at the Methodists.
Yes, there's a very direct appeal to those in derision called Methodists. It implores them, set an example to the Christian world, at least in this one instance, be the ones who actually follow this rule. Put ye away evil speaking, tale-bearing, whispering. Let none of them proceed out of your mouth.
It wants this rule following to be their defining characteristic.
Absolutely. It says, look, if people are going to single you out, let this be the distinguishing mark of a Methodist. He censures no man behind his back. By this fruit ye may know him. It's a call to make this difficult, loving, confrontational process the hallmark of their community life.
That's a huge challenge. Don't just avoid the negative. Actively embrace this positive, demanding process. And the sermon also puts responsibility on the listener, right? Not just the speaker.
Yes, that's another crucial part. It says, hear evil of no man. The logic is simple. If there were no hearers, there would be no speakers of evil. It even compares the listener to a receiver of stolen goods. The receiver as bad as the thief. Listening makes you part of the problem.
So if someone starts telling you about someone else's fault and that person isn't there, your job isn't just to nod along sympathetically.
Definitely not. The instruction is to stop them. Resolutely refuse to hear. And if they say they're burdened and just need to talk, you point them back to the process. Go then, and be delivered of thy burden in the way the Lord hath ordained.
Which means step 1, go talk to the person directly.
Exactly. But at the peril of thy soul, tell it to no one else, either before or after, unless it's that one emergency exception to protect someone innocent. It puts the onus on both speaker and hearer to stick to the prescribed method.
So if this demanding rule, this whole process, were actually followed consistently, what does the sermon imagine the result would be? What are the positive effects?
It paints a really beautiful picture. On a personal level, individuals would find peace flow as a river, and their love for God would grow. Within the community, brotherly love would continually increase, because the main thing that poisons it, evil speaking, would be gone. Members would naturally start to care for each other more deeply.
That idea of if one member suffered, all would suffer with it. It sounds like a genuinely healthy, supportive community.
It's a powerful vision of unity. And crucially, the sermon connects this internal community health directly to its impact on the outside world. It believes that when the wild, unthinking world sees Christians handling conflict and faults with this level of love and integrity, they'd be forced to say, see how these Christians love one another.
And that witness becomes evangelistic.
Yes, that observable love and unity born from following this difficult process would convince the world and prepare them also for his kingdom. It links it right back to Jesus' prayer in John 17, that they all may be one, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me.
So, handling internal conflict well isn't just about being nice or keeping the peace internally. It's actually presented as fundamental to the church's mission to the world.
That's the argument. The internal practice is the external witness in many ways.
Okay, so wrapping this up, this deep dive into the cure of evil speaking has given us a really challenging definition of the problem speaking ill of anyone absent, even if it's true, and this incredibly structured biblical process for dealing with faults.
Yeah, it's a clear pathway. Private talk first, then mediated conversation, then leadership involvement, and a defined outcome if reconciliation fails. It stands in stark contrast to just talking about people.
And it throws down a gauntlet, especially to communities like the Methodists historically, to make this difficult practice a core part of their identity. It makes you think, doesn't it? How different would our own interactions be in families, workplaces, online, faith groups, if this was the norm? If instead of venting or gossiping, we committed to this kind of direct, albeit difficult, loving confrontation?
It really does make you wonder. And that leaves us with a pretty big question for you, the listener, to reflect on. We live in an age of instant messaging, social media, constant commentary about others, often absent others. Conflict flares up publicly or simmers privately. In this context, could this ancient, very prescribed method emphasizing directness, mediation, community accountability, and love actually offer a practical path to healthier relationships and stronger communities? Or is it just too demanding, too countercultural, maybe even naive for our modern lives?